like it's suspicious that the screen is dark, though.
It is still starting.
Okay, but look, we have backup, Ms. Leo in the back. So thank you for bearing with us. We'll get started. My name is Clayton Maxwell. I have a 3rd grader, and then I have a 7th grader who went all the way through Lee. I've been here for a while, and I love it. And the fact that you guys could make time to be here tonight is really amazing. So I know there's a lot going on. We're all really busy, but I feel like there's nothing better I would rather be talking about with you guys right now, and I feel like there's no better team in Austin right now to help us do that talking and have this conversation. So I'm really appreciative, and I'm going to let Lamia do the introductions, but we have some great folks on board tonight. So I really hope you guys at home who couldn't make it and you have sick kids are actually able to watch this right now.
There is no internet connection. I'm not watching it.
Rats.
So you can just videotape it and then upload it to YouTube.
We need that shit on a tripod or something. I just feel bad that you're holding it.
Oh, you
want to put it on this?
just
Jerry
rig
something, just
Well,
Yeah.
it's not connected to the
Put it
internet.
right here, and
Can't we just like prop it up against this?
Here.
Like, right here? This
I mean, there really are
Point it
enough
out that way.
people at home who texted me and said, I can't make it, please video it. So I feel,
We should do Netflix. We're just like,
yeah, that would be
We
good.
should.
watch us.
I'm ready to sign on with Netflix.
yeah, we'll do it.
So thank you so much to Lee and the Lee PTA for bringing us all together. One of the things I really appreciated so much about the panel last May is the way that Lamia holds the form, and we start on time and we end on time. So I'm a little sorry we're getting a little bit of a late start, but I will now hand it over. And so thanks for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Clayton.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm an overclapper, so I'm going to clap for you. Big shout out to you, Clayton, for getting us all organized. And I also want to give a shout out to Aisha Gail Turner, who helped put this panel together as well. And then Clayton kept it going. I'm just so appreciative of all your efforts. So my name is Lamia Bahrainwala. Feel free to call me LB or Lamia. I'm an assistant professor of communication studies at Southwestern University up in Georgetown. And I study U.S. race discourse and how we both talk about race and don't talk about race in the United States. So I'm very, very happy to be here. I'm especially happy to be here in such wonderful, fine company. So what I wanted to do for the next 5 minutes or so was just a few things. The first is I wanted to frame the panel, so how we envision this being a useful tool for you. The second thing I wanted to do was establish some rules for discussion, and that goes for both my panelists as well as all of you in the audience, how we can use our time really well. Then I want to introduce my wonderful panelists, and then I'm going to ask the first question. So we have done this panel before at Lee Elementary School, and it's a panel about how to talk about race with your children. So a couple of reasons that we see this panel being useful is because, first, both race and racism are not natural concepts. They have to be manufactured and they have to be learned. And so we believe that the best time to intervene is when your children are really young and are beginning to form those concepts. That's a wonderful time to intervene. So we're very grateful to be able to speak to parents of elementary school children. The second thing I wanted to point out to frame this panel is that this panel is really an effort at anti-racism. And there's a difference between being not racist and being anti-racist. So when you say you're not racist, what that means is that you're not setting out to be racist or to discriminate based on race. But what a lot of social justice activists as well as theorists will tell you is that racism is embedded in our systems. And what that means is that those systems will continue to reproduce those systems and distributions of power. And if we want more equity, we have to actually interrupt those systems. We have to make efforts to change those systems, particularly when they're not visibly or overtly racist to our eyes. So that's the difference between being not racist versus being anti-racist. Panels like this is an attempt to really be anti-racist, and I think all of you attending, which is taking time out away from your children, clearly you're all parents. Do you know how incredible it is bringing this many parents together outside of school and daycare hours? It's incredible. And so these efforts are anti-racist efforts on your part as well as ours, as well as the Lee Elementary School staff. So now I wanted to introduce my panelists. I'm so excited to tell you a little bit about their expertise. So I'm going to start with Roberto Herman, who's right here in the middle. Do you want to wait to everyone? Just making you perform for everybody. So Roberto is a community activist as well as a youth educator, and he's actually the head of Headwaters Middle School in Austin. And you used to be the head of an administrator at Magnolia Montessori School, which is also a multicultural educational establishment. So I'm really grateful to have you here, Roberto, because he can bring not only an educational background to this panel, but he can also bring a little bit of community activist praxis as well. Roberto is a product of Massachusetts Public Schools, and he is an MA in education as well as a BA in English. So you bring so many valuable pieces to this panel, Roberto, and I thank you for being here. And I know you have two little ones of your own who you've left and made time to make this anti-racist panel come together. So my second panelist over here is Katie Malinsky, and Katie is going to be here to offer us a child development perspective. And she is a licensed clinical and social worker, and I'm so grateful to have Katie on the panel because she will be able to give us really concrete strategies to deploy in those moments when our kids ask us very difficult, challenging, and awkward questions about race. Katie will be able to speak to that in very specific ways, and so will my other panelists as well. She has expertise on parent-child relationships as well as childhood behavior, and I wanted to share a quote from Katie's website. She says on her website, you know, she has a webinar as well about how to talk about race with your children, which she did with a partner. And on her website, she says that it is the responsibility of white folks and white parents to lean into these uncomfortable conversations. And I thought that was a really circumspect comment, and I wanted to share that with everyone over here. So welcome, Katie. I'm so glad you decided to return to our panel. And my third panelist is Dr. Richard Reddick, right over here at the end. And Rich has also done this panel not once but twice before. I'm so glad you decided to return, Rich. He
Well,
is
it's for you, because you're so good at doing this.
Oh my gosh, let's just keep this love fest going and ignore everyone else. So Rich is both in education as well as a diversity policy expert. He's an associate professor of educational leadership and policy at the University of Texas at Austin. And his research looks at the experience of faculty members in predominantly white institutions. So it is really looking at what higher education looks like when we study power associated with race and whiteness. What I was really excited to see Rich doing over several years, over really a lot of your career, is working with the city of Austin to create a structural inequality task force. So he is also an activist in addition to all of the research he does, which is widely published. So we have a real diversity of experience and expertise on this panel. So I'm really glad that you are here to be able to visit with these scholars and speakers and get to ask your questions and share your comments with us as well. So I wanted to take a minute just to talk about how we're going to use the next, let me see, 75 minutes that we have together. So I have 5 questions drafted up, and I'm going to set aside 30 minutes for our panelists to speak, and the last 45 minutes for all of you, our audience, to really ask us questions. And the goal of keeping the panel discussion a little bit shorter is so that we can really get to your specific questions and hear the nitty-gritty about how your own kids behave, the types of questions they ask, their own idiosyncrasies, and also hear from you about your own concerns and ways that you've handled questions from them in the past about race. We really want to hear from all of you as, you know, our audience, because we are here for all of you ultimately at the end of the day. So panelists, I'm going to ask you 5 questions. They're going to seem familiar because these are similar to the questions I asked the last time we did this panel. And what I'm going to do is throw each question to one of you. And if there's a little bit time left over, I'm going to open up the floor for the rest of you to answer those questions as well. Maybe keep your answer to about 3 minutes or so, and I'll have a timer up for you so you can see that time. And as far as our Q&A time, we have about 45 minutes set aside for that. what I thought we could do is make sure that our questions, when you're asking questions of the panelists, try to keep them as short as possible, not because this is your time and we want you to use it wisely, but we also want to make sure that our panelists are not lost in the question that you're asking. So you want to keep it short. A good rule of thumb for how long your questions should be is your question should be maybe around 20 seconds long when it's spoken out loud. So I did have some note cards that I want to pass out. If you want to take one and pass them down. I like writing down my questions as they come up. So if anything occurs to you during the discussion, please go ahead and write it down. And if you need any pens, I've got some stationery here as well, so feel free to come up and grab a pen. During the Q&A, you're more than welcome to give us comments as well. If you want to add to things that the panelists have said, we really, really welcome your comments in addition to your questions. But if I see discussion moving away from the focus of the panel, I will intervene because that is my job as a moderator. I will be forced to use my teacher's voice, though I'm happy to say that I haven't ever had to do that when we've done panels like these, and we've had just the most wonderful experience hearing from all of you. So does anybody have any questions before we get started? I see smiling and tentative faces. So this seems like a good time to get started with the panel. All right, I'm going to ask the first question. So I'm going to throw this question to you, Rich, and then maybe we might have a little bit of time, Katie, for you and Roberto to contribute. So have any of you heard the term color blindness before? I see some of you nodding and some of you looking a little uncertain. So the term colorblindness is a popular term which describes the idea that you should not see race, not see skin color as a way to combat racism. Because if you don't see race and skin color, then you're better able to treat people equally and move towards equity. So, Rich, I want to ask you, what are your thoughts about colorblindness when it comes to teaching our children about race?
It's a great place to start. So first of all, thank you for having us. Thank you to Clayton for arranging this, and Lamia for being our excellent moderator and my fellow panelists. I also should point out that I'm an Austin native and I'm an AISD graduate, so I'm always happy to come back to AISD schools and talk to folks. But so, there's another way of talking about color blindness, and the term is color muteness. This is a term that one of my professors at graduate school, Michael Pollock, came up with. And basically, the problem with the colorblind sort of ideology is it assumes equity. There's no equity in the whole thing. So that a lot of times it's people trying to avoid this comfort of talking about privilege and advantage and oppression, right? So if I'm in the privileged group, and I talk about my identities in multiple ways. I have multiple identities, one of which is male. That's a privileged identity in society. So if I am sort of blind to the fact that everybody else has the experiences in the world I have, that's a problem, right? So when you tell people I'm colorblind, or even better, I don't see color. You don't care if you're black, blue, or purple. Nobody's black or purple. Nobody's purple or blue, right? It's almost dismissing the validity of people's experiences. Like, for instance, I'm a black man. I like being black. I think it's great being black. A lot of my experiences in the world have been about being black, and they're wonderful. I've experienced some challenges in that, but I like that. If you tell me you don't see my color, then you don't see me. And that's a really, I think, shocking thing, because people often think, well, you don't want to be seen as a person who is black or woman or LGBTQA or whatever. But I'm like, actually, it's part of our identities. That's who we are. So you don't want to ignore that. You don't want to obsess over it and say, well, speaking as a black person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But like, no, it's part of my experience. So I remember when I was in college, I think one of my classmates was trying to be kind and say, I don't see you as a black person, I see you as rich. I'm like, you don't see me then, because I'm really black. That is part of who I am. It comes out in how I sort of deal with the world, and I actually like that part of my identity. The other thing is it sort of avoids us talking about things like sort of established privilege in the racial categories of whiteness. We talk about, oftentimes, folks of color, but we don't talk about white people or whiteness or white privilege or white systems of oppression. And I have to remind people that nobody in this room created white supremacy or white privilege, but you certainly can be sort of, to Lamia's point, if you're not actively engaging and dismantling those processes, you are in some ways sort of just going along with the flow and actually aiding and abetting that process. And benefiting, yes.
Rich, I appreciate how you pointed out that erasure of race is not a compliment.
It's not.
Katie, I can hear you starting to say something.
What I wanted to add was that there's research on when children start to spot race, and it's as early as 6 months. So even just the concept that someone could be colorblind, I think, is a fallacy. If 6-month-old babies spot the differences in race, of course we all see it. Right. There's other research about older kids, like 5 and 6-year-olds, given cards with faces on them, and are told, hey, sort these however you like, and it's like 70% of them sort according to race. So it's one of the most easily and at a distance identifiable physical features of a person is the color of their skin, so of course we see it. Of course we see it. I have more to say, but I'll stop.
Well, I have a question specifically for you, Roberto, in a minute. But I did want to segue towards the next question, because you kind of led into that, Katie, which is, how do children begin to learn about race?
Mm-hmm. So it's there, it's everywhere, we can all see it. And the thing that I think is important for us to hold is that in America, race is a social construct. And this is a hard thing for me to explain. You guys will probably be able to do a better job than me. But race isn't a biological determinant that comes with this, delineated set of characteristics. Race is created in our society. It's like we have these agreements about what it means to have this skin color or that skin color, for better or worse. And when we do or don't talk about race, we're teaching children these sort of invisible social rules. And they learn it from the very beginning. They learn it when they see that we only spend time with people who have our same skin color. They learn it when they have a kid who has a different skin color, but we don't mention that they look different. It's everywhere, color differences are, and whether you talk about them or whether you don't, children are picking that up all the time. There's also some research around when you don't talk about race, children sometimes assume negative things about it. So when you aren't talking about race, and I'm white, and all of the people that we hang out with are white, children are likely to assume that we have decided against hanging out with people who have a different skin color. Children make up stories. It's just part of how they work, how their brains work. When they don't understand something, they make up a story to explain it to themselves, and those stories are rarely accurate, and sometimes they're a little horrifying when we find them out. And that certainly happens around race.
Katie, can you give us a few examples of places where kids learn about race from?
I'm sorry, I feel like saying everywhere and everything. That's probably not detailed enough.
Everywhere is the first
But
one that
accurate.
came to my mind.
Yes, but accurate.
Schools,
Media.
schools, places of worship.
Your neighbors, what do your neighbors look like? If you go to, well, you just said places of worship. If you go to church,
Household.
what do your church look like? What do your teachers look like?
TV.
Local parks,
Yeah.
local pools.
One of my favorite examples is, because it was just a personal realization, I was in the Capitol, the Texas Capitol, and I was looking at all the portraits of the governors, and for a long time I've noticed there were only 2 women, and then, a little later I was like, oh, they're all white. So, what's it like to be in a space where, as a white person, it's a little easier for me to ignore the lack of diversity. But my kids learn from that. When they look at the pictures of all of the governors, they see all the guys who are white. There's a lesson about race in that.
I think it's really interesting, Katie, that you're pointing out that kids learn not just from what we say about race, but from what we don't say about race. So they habitually see us avoiding any discussion of race. So they learn from omission. So
I grew up in rural Louisiana, and I certainly was, my family wasn't racist in the way that I used to define the word, but most of the people around me very much were. It was a very actively racist part of the world. sorry, I just lost my thread. What did you just say to me?
You were saying you grew up in Louisiana.
No, what did you say
and
before
before that, kids learning from a mission. Women don't talk about race.
Right. So what I was taught from my relatively not racist family was that you should not talk about race, because the people who talked about race were members of the KKK, and they said awful things. And so the higher state of being in my world when I grew up was to not talk about race. There were only two choices, and the good one, the sort of moral high ground, was don't talk about race. And so it was really quite a few decades later that I finally realized that's no longer the moral, it never was, but I've matured more, and I can see there's a better moral high ground. And so I feel like it's really important for us to lean in and talk about race. Not talking about it sends different messages.
A key takeaway from what Katie's also pointing out is that it's a myth that racists talk about race. In fact, you have to talk about race to not be racist, because that is the only way to be anti-racist. So thanks for bringing up that perspective, Katie. Roberta, I wanted to ask you, and then, I want you to chime in as well, Katie. We've talked a little bit about the problems with color blindness, as well as how children begin to learn about race. Can you tell us some concrete strategies, as well as specific language that we can use to talk to children about race?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. Glad to be back. I'm glad to contribute to this conversation. It's always encouraging when I see people who are willing to come out and engage in these very courageous conversations. So I think it's important to be authentic in engaging in these conversations, and sometimes there's hesitancy to engage in the conversation because of fear, particularly the fear of what we do not know, and the fear of saying something that is not politically correct, let's say. And so I think it's important to wrestle with that fear. And the simple advice I could offer is get over it, right? A couple of my colleagues here, and I think they're getting to know my leadership style. I'm new to the school where I'm serving at, and I think they're probably sensing that I'm quite direct. That works for some people, for others maybe not. But I think in this case, just all the beating around the bush stuff, it just makes things even more awkward. And it's interesting to think about something that's so prevalent in our lives, and yet something that so many of us shy away from. And so we have to lean into that discomfort, and we have to be authentic about what we know and what we don't know. And in thinking about supporting children in learning about race, and this is a humbling lesson that I learned at Magnolia when I was serving there. Just working with the kids and understanding the Montessori model really taught me to humble myself in terms of how to engage with the children and being honest about sharing like what I know and what I don't know, but also being intentional about working on obtaining that knowledge so then I can transfer it. So being authentic, being intentional, being anti-racist requires a great deal of intentionality. And it requires thought, and it requires being willing to take risk. We're willing to take all types of risk in life, right? But sometimes we're very reserved when it comes to taking a risk around something that not only are we uncomfortable with, but it might make somebody else uncomfortable. And so how do you get to a place where you could come over the hump a bit on that? Well, practice makes perfect. So you have to start engaging in that practice and modeling that expectation for the children. And I'll give you an example. Yesterday I was subbing in the classroom at our school, sixth graders. Sixth graders are fun. And the subject, the content this class focuses on has to do with adolescent development. And we're identifying certain areas, and one of them was self-esteem. And so I pressed in a little bit on that. And I encouraged them to reflect on our pact to be peacemakers, advocates, creators, thinkers, and to reflect on, how is it that we advocate for peace at our school environment, and what is it that we do to boost the self-esteem of others. Then we went to this exercise where I said, well, let's model this now. Let's practice this amongst one another so that later on in the day, you can go and do this same exercise with somebody who's not necessarily in your peer group. You gotta, get out of your comfort zone and offer a compliment to somebody who might not be expecting it from you. When we were doing the exercise, I went over to a young lady. Now that I think about it, she's actually the only black girl. It's okay to say black, by the way. That was a joke, but it's also not a joke because, again, we got to wrestle with this discomfort. And sometimes we're very uncomfortable using terms that we should be using. So I walked over to the young lady and I said, so-and-so, your skin is so beautiful. And she was just like, she was not expecting that whatsoever. And her peers were also like, huh? And they didn't say much, but we all knew it was a moment. Now, I knew what I was doing. I understand that the environment that she's in, and I understand how I could support her in these very simple yet meaningful ways. But I'm also modeling for the others a way in which they can engage with one another and recognize the beauty of our differences.
So you're saying go ahead and demonstrate what it looks like to talk about race so that other children are also comfortable participating in that.
Yes.
And that's our effort to move away from colorblindness. Katie, what are some concrete strategies and language we can use?
So I would start out with asking yourself a question, because there's 1,000 different types of conversations about race and many different reasons why you would have conversations about race. Are you having a conversation because you want your family to be able to talk about it and you think we just need to do this more? Are you having a conversation about race to put some particular experience into a larger context? Maybe your kid had something happen and they need to process it, or maybe you want to help your child to sort of move into anti-racism sort of political justice. There's a lot of different reasons why we would have conversations about race, and each one of those is going to come with a different set of lessons and goals and ways of relating. So that's kind of where you start, is like, why am I having this conversation, right? And then beyond that, I would say I'll just real quickly, and I have this in a handout form if anybody wants it, ask me afterwards. I have a few copies and I can email it to you with links in it. But think of different ages of kids, because of course different aged kids need different types of lessons. So if you've got like a preschooler, a really little kid, you want to look to create opportunities to talk about race in very basic, concrete ways. So that's going to be things like physical descriptions of people. Yes, he is black, his skin is brown, her eyes are green. We use color language to describe people's physical appearances. Maybe the child says it, or maybe you answer a question, or maybe you just describe them. Who is Miss Smith? You remember, she's the lady with brown skin at your school. A second way to create opportunities for really any age kid, but especially little ones, is books. I've brought a couple with me that I think are lovely, and I'll pass around if you want to flip through them. All the colors we are and shades are of Shades of People. These are just books that specifically talk about race and talking about color. And use particular vocabulary words. Like when you're talking about with little kids, race words, you could talk about black or African American. Different people do, my understanding, when I've asked, people prefer different words depending on their own identity. White, Hispanic, Asian, all sorts of different words. When your kids get a little older, when they're in sort of lower elementary, again, books are still appropriate. You're building on the conversations that you've had before. This is also a place where you can advocate for lessons on race at school. I bet a bunch of you saw the thing on Facebook. It's been 6 months or more, with a high school student who was asked to create a list of pros and cons of slavery. Did you guys see that? Pros and cons of slavery. And the guy did a good job. He was like, here's all the cons. There were no pros. You go, kid.
Right.
But I will also, like, super short personal story, in my daughter, who is also in 3rd grade, she came home some months ago and said, "Mommy, did you ever get segregation when you were little?" And you know, she had learned about it in school. They learned about what segregation was, and I was so thankful for her teacher for doing that, because it just provided this beautiful opportunity for me to share some of my. I grew up in rural Louisiana, so yeah, I got segregation when I was little, and I had some personal stories that I could share with her, and we talked about what that was like and how it made me feel and how it probably made other people feel. And so advocating for lessons on race at school is a really concrete way to sort of crack the door open or push it open even wider with kids that age. Also, noticing non-diverse spaces, so like the governor's portraits, your neighborhood, your church, stuff like that. Noticing those things and talking about them, that's a really great way to sort of increase the conversations. Vocabulary words and concepts for this age: segregation, civil rights, slavery, racism, privilege, cultural awareness, pride. Those are all concepts that are going to be, you know, generally appropriate for elementary school kids. And then when you get to sort of upper elementary and above, again, books, noticing bias in homework or in school books or in media, watching videos, sharing videos, talking about current events. There are 1,000 current events every week that you could talk about that have to do with race. Maybe you hear it on the radio, maybe it's on the news, maybe you just bring it up over dinner. Those are really great ways to stimulate conversations about race. Identifying privilege and questioning privilege and taking political action. Those are all really good ways to create opportunities to talk about, and then as they get older, to take action against racism and all sorts of social injustice. Real quickly, some vocabulary words for older kids: microaggression, and micro-invalidations. I only learned about micro-invalidations a year ago, but a microaggression is like the little teeny tiny, Richard, you just said one. I don't see you as black. Your
Right.
roommate, right?
Yeah.
Like little comments that are insensitive or insulting or offensive, and they may not even be meant to be hurtful at all, but when you have a lifetime of those little cuts, that's a giant wound. Micro-invalidations, well, that's kind of a micro-invalidation too. Like, let's say that you have a name that is non-traditional, and nobody ever tries to learn how to say it right? You know, that is invalidating of who you are and of your identity. And once, okay, fine, once, but when every teacher that you've ever had calls you Miss Smith because they don't want to try to learn how to pronounce your name, that's a micro-invalidation. Systemic injustice, coping with emotions related to race, yours and others, what your child can do to make things better, and historic atrocities. So that was more than my 3 minutes, sorry. But anyway, if you want,
so much in there.
I've got a handout that I'm happy to send you electronically.
Do you mind if I pass the handout?
Sure, of course.
And you're welcome to
I've
take
got a couple
photographs of this and also come up and talk to Katie after the panel. But
The back page of it has a list of resources that are hot links. So if you email me, I'll send it to you so you can just click.
Katie, you ran through some really important points I wanted to highlight to make sure we hit on them. One thing Katie pointed out is that you are welcome to describe children and even give descriptions of race, because what you're doing is offering descriptions, and that's good modeling. What you're not offering is cultural associations with race. You're simply describing appearance, and that's modeling good behavior that's age appropriate. Katie also pointed out that when kids are confused about why there's one black kid or all the black kids or the Hispanic kids sit together, that is a great teachable moment for highlighting a moment in history when before desegregation happened, or Reconstruction and how that impacted who looks like you in school and so on, so using historical examples. And then also exposing whiteness when you're just walking around your neighborhood or walking around the Capitol building and looking at the photographs of governors or flipping through the pages of a magazine, repeatedly saying, oh, they're all, white models. What does this mean? Why do you think this is? So those are great specific strategies. All right, so we have about 5 minutes, but I think we can go a little bit over that time. No, don't apologize. So Roberta, I wanted to throw a question to you. And that question is pretty specific. It is, how do we talk to children of color about race? Now, that answer can be implied in the strategies that Katie and Rich have already given us, but given our anti-racist efforts today, I do want to carve out a space for talking to children of color about race as well. What are some ways we can approach that, Roberto?
I think besides the strategies that were mentioned, like to place an emphasis on acknowledgement So acknowledging who they are, acknowledging their identities, and also empowering them to fully embrace who they are, to fully embrace their cultures, to celebrate that, to share that. In addition to that, to educate, for them to receive education, but also for them to educate themselves in terms of who they are, where they come from, because a lot of history has been erased, right? And so when we think about who controls history and what's being shared, and we think about school curriculums and what our kids are learning about, and we could all probably just reflect on what we learned at different points along our educational journey. And particularly I'm thinking about K through 12, then there's so many people groups whose histories have not been recognized, have not been celebrated, have been completely erased. And even as I reflect on my own heritage and ancestry, much of what I know came from self-research, particularly late in high school and once I got into undergrad. I can't recall, I'm not sure if any of my teachers ever taught me anything that was beyond maybe a couple paragraphs in the history book, Martin Luther King. I mean, the fact that I'm struggling to come up with the other ones, that tells you something, right?
But you know, Roberto, you have 2 young children as well, and I'm sure you talk to them about race. What are some things you say to them?
Yeah, we talk about our culture, we talk about our history. So in terms of my skin color, I identify as a black man. In terms of my heritage, or my nationality, I'm American. In terms of my heritage, I'm Dominican. So we celebrate all of that. And my kids, they see it reflected in our household in terms of the artwork. They see it reflected in terms of the artifacts, like la guira, an instrument used to play merengue, used to play bachata. They experience it in terms of our intentionality around teaching them the Spanish language. They experience it in terms of some of our customs and traditions that we uphold, rooted in our Dominicanness. They experience it in terms of history that we share with them. Keep in mind, my daughter's going to be 4 in January, and my son's 8 months. But ever since they were born, it's been like, all right, you don't understand what I'm saying, but this is practice. So that as you continue to grow older, so Annalise, she'll be 4. There are certain things that she understands now, and interestingly enough, and again, this is where having worked at an elementary school and working with early childhood and being in Montessori really taught me a lot about how much we as adults often underestimate children. And thankfully I went through that experience, and my daughter was born around the time shortly after I started working there, and so I was able to pick up a lot that I transferred into my parenting practice. And so I've noticed how much my daughter absorbs and how much then she responds to certain things that I'll engage her in. And I'll offer an example. Several months ago, my mother was visiting. This was around the time my son was born, so March. My mother's an interesting woman. I love her.
Well, that says a lot right
So
there.
like a minefield.
And we had this debate about my Dominicanness. Now, my mother was born, she's a Dominican immigrant, she's been in this country a long time. So she was rejecting the notion when I would say like I'm Dominican, because I was born here, so she would reject that. I'm like, you understand, like you're my mother, right? Like, I received this from you, like this Dominicanness. You're not Dominican. So my daughter was like, she was listening to this debate the whole time, and listening to the things that I was telling my mother, and then she just bust out like, Daddy, you're Dominican. Daddy, I'm Dominican. And my mom was there, she's hearing this. And so now my mom's getting worked up. She's like, yeah, Dominican. Abuela, I'm Dominican. Papi's Dominican.
Case closed.
And so, so even in the language that we're using and the content that we're sharing out, like at 3.5 years old, you know, picking that up and holding on to that, and like now I've leveraged that to go deeper into teaching her about like our culture. You know, this music that we listen to, this merengue music that we listen to, this bachata music that we listen to, which also gives me an opportunity to take this further. Like, and right now, again, and you mentioned this in terms of like age-appropriate content and how we share that, right? But we're gonna get into the African diaspora, because, you know, when you look at the history of Dominicans and you look, just right, we could get into all this, but I'm keeping it here. When you look at the history of the Dominican Republic, a place that where a lot of people experience black denial. So we, you know, now we're talking about like internalized oppression based on race. When we look at the history of the Dominican Republic, like most of the natives were murdered by Columbus and company, and so Dominicans will still claim like Tainos or Arawaks, but like that's not accurate. No. Like, really, your ancestry is probably African or European, Spaniards in particular, or a mixture. That's what it is. And so, as Annalise gets older, you know, we're going to engage in these very interesting conversations that will lead us to a lot of research about our history, about our heritage, and trying to trace back roots as far as possible. And so there's an opportunity to do that there that will be an opportunity to empower her and my son Zion, to empower our children to really embrace the journey of researching their own history and the history of other people whose knowledge is power. And so just as we would do that with children of color, with children from global majority, we should be doing that with all children. And I think that's part of my responsibility as an educator, and look at the kids that I'm serving now, and I'm like, well, there's a lot of things that you need to know, that you should know, that will help you to have a greater impact in this world, to relate to people, to connect to people, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of like strategies and whatnot when it comes to this. And Brian Stevenson, he wrote a book called Just Mercy. If you haven't read it, you should check it out. But one of his big notions in Just Mercy is the notion of proximity. And to me, that's particularly important. One of the reasons I'm comfortable engaging in conversations about race, and one of the reasons I'm comfortable engaging with people across differences, whether racial differences or otherwise, is because I'm constantly around people who are not necessarily like me, who are not necessarily Dominican, who are not necessarily black, who do not necessarily speak Spanish. And so it forces me to learn, to engage, but it also gives me the opportunity to share of who I am, of my cultures, the things I celebrate, and where do we have commonality, where do we have differences, and looking at differences is just that, like, you know, the fact that we have differences doesn't make me better, doesn't make you better. You know, they're differences, and we can celebrate that and learn from each other.
One interesting thing that you're pointing out, Roberto, is as parents, we don't have to shy away from nuance when we are talking about race with children, because Annalise understands a lot more than you might have thought, and young children understand a lot more than you think. And one of the problems with how racism perpetuates itself is that we remove all nuance, we flatten groups. And so returning that nuance and normalizing nuance is really important for children, which I think is a wonderful point that you demonstrated through your stories. All right, so we have a couple more minutes, and Rich, I want to throw this last question back to you. We've talked about how to talk to children of color about race. I'm wondering about how we talk about whiteness when we talk to our children about race. And that doesn't just mean being white, but it also means holding access to systems of power. So if you speak English, if you belong to any norms, if your parents have an advanced degree, all of these are examples of whiteness, even if you may not be white yourself. So how do we talk about whiteness, systems of power, as well as being actually white, being, of European descent to our children?
So one thing, when Katie and Roberta were talking, I was thinking about the importance of reframing, right? So, and I'm thinking about the work of Beverly Daniel Tatum, who wrote the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? It's a great title, and it's a question that often gets asked, right? If you reframe that, doesn't it mean that the kids who are not black are sitting together, right?
That's true.
And so a lot of times when, and this is back to Katie's point, when you observe something, to reframe it and say, doesn't that mean that the people who are white, and the thing about whiteness in the American context, and it's important to understand this is historical. This is not something that came up because people were PC or whatever. This is a historical movement. And in fact, I was talking to one of my students about apartheid in South Africa, and that the South African government studied American apartheid as the model. Like, you've learned how to do this really well. We need to get lessons from you. And so, understanding that, the establishment, it just came through Thanksgiving. I'm sitting there watching Charlie Brown Thanksgiving, which I love, but also I'm like, oh my God, this is like, this is genocide of Native peoples in the real, that happened. That is not something we talk about, but genocide is the word that we use. The Taino and Arawaks, I'm half Jamaican. That's the Native people who lived in the island of Jamaica. Nobody survived that through, if you've read Guns, Germs, and Steel, you know about, there's a term they use about the diseases that Europeans brought that wiped people out, plus conquest, plus guns. It's to, eliminate people. And we have to start by talking about the elimination of Native peoples from this continent, and then the forcible removal of people who are native to this country to other places. I was in Tennessee recently, and Trail of Tears. We talk about, most of my students have, what are you talking about? I'm like, yeah, the people who live in Oklahoma aren't from Oklahoma. They were moved there using military and structural apparatus. That's something that happened, but it continues to happen, to Lamia's point. Like, whiteness as a category, and I think the best way to talk about this is how people become white. And so, if any of this room is of Irish descent or Italian descent, from your family histories, you were not white at one point in time. You were Irish, and you were Italian, or you were Polish, and that was not a good thing. But the way whiteness works is that if you're willing to surrender certain things, like your native language or your names, make them easier to pronounce, maybe by the second or third generation, you get granted whiteness. And whiteness is amazing, right? Privileges, advantages, lack of oppression, and so on and so forth. For folks of color, there are impediments to that access. And trust me, people have tried to get access to whiteness who are not phenotypically white.
Sammy Sosa.
Yeah, that's a. Look at Sammy Sosa's pictures over the years from Black.
Kim?
Yeah. What this is something that's really powerful. We talk about this a lot in my classes I teach. Like, in every developing country in the world, really every country in the world, you can find products to lighten your skin.
Yes.
South America, Central America, Asia, Africa, the Caribbean. We've put a premium on whiteness, phenotypical whiteness. If you've read Stephen Jay Gould's work, The Mismeasure of Man, he talks about sort of this product of sort of exalting Europeanness and whiteness. And that's a project that's ongoing. It didn't stop. People often think, well, that was then. Roberto just gave you a couple examples of people today doing that kind of thing. And even when I think about, one of the problems I get frustrated with is the idea that whiteness is sort of fixed and I'm white and that's bad. Well, you're not just white. You are Polish, you're Italian. In this room, most of you probably are German or have some German descent. I always ask this question: what's the largest ethnic group in the United States? Latinos, African, it's German Americans. And we're in Central Texas. This is a really German place. Fredericksburg, New Braunfels, and so Schlitterbahn, exactly. So for instance, we talk to students. Often will ask me at some point in time. I teach college, and they didn't have parents like you, so they're like, "Why do we have Black History Month?" Okay, let's talk about that. What are your heritages? And they often don't know. But if you do some digging, you find out you've got German ancestry or Swedish ancestry. I belong to a Lutheran church. Everyone in the church was Swedish or Norwegian or German. something you learn, and you have food and artifacts. And they explain to people the way that the diaspora worked is that when Africans were forcibly taken from African nations, they came here and lost a lot of that. So we say African American. Why African American? It's an identity with a continent, but most of us, thanks to DNA technology, I'm mostly Nigerian. I found that out, it's new to me. I didn't know that. And I've never been to Nigeria, and nobody in my family has a Nigerian identity. Of course, Nigerian friends are like, oh, we knew you were Nigerian. But like being from the West Indies, you know, my family is comprised of folks who are Asian, who are white, and that is an interesting concept, especially looking at how race and whiteness is constructed in different places. So a good friend of mine is South African, and he considers himself colored. Like, I would say his identity, it probably comes from South Asia, but he says, you know, you guys have a weird concept because you have this one drop rule. And so we have these concepts like, you know, mulatto, octoroon, quadroon, these things that are horrible terms, but explaining it, you have a black grandparent, you're black. And you probably know the stories of people in the South who passed, who were able to live as white people, who presented very white. John Hope, who was the first black president of Morehouse College. Google John Hope and let me know if you can tell he's a black person. He is the most light-skinned, fairest looking person. I know his grandson, who also, when I talk to him over the phone, this is my own stereotyping. I talked to him on the phone for many years. He's my fraternity brother. He sounds like a black guy. I go to a meeting and there's a guy wearing a name tag that says Richard Hope. I'm like, that's not Richard Hope. That's a white dude, you know? And at some point, and you know, we code switch, so we often talk differently around different people. He's like, hey, Rich, how you doing? I'm like, oh my God, it's him. And I should know this. I come from a family, we have people who are lighter than a lot of you in this room, and they are people who identify as black.
You mean all black people are not the same?
Not the same, no. Even in my own family, my sister's lighter skinned than me. And so that's a big thing too. So I think, back to Lamia's question about whiteness, is that, first of all, to not escape the fact that, first of all, you have ethnicity and race. They're not the same thing. Ethnicity is their national, cultural origin, and that's something you should research and find out about, right? I lived in Boston. We lived in Massachusetts for many years. Everybody's Irish on, you know, March 17th, right? Everybody finds that Irish relative they have. But, you know, there's other ethnicities that we can talk about and actually say it's a great thing to be from this identity and have these cultural customs. And yes, we do tend to homogenize things as like whiteness. But then it's easier to understand, well, why would somebody who's Latinx or somebody who's Dominican or somebody who is Puerto Rican embrace that? Well, you embrace your Irish heritage, they embrace that heritage, and it's great. And they don't see it as a negative thing, they see it as a great thing. So I think it's a lot about just reframing and understanding that, but also understanding that whiteness is a sort of subliminal project that's working, and part of whiteness is the erasure and normalization of what is white as being the standard.
Right.
You're deviant because you're not white. If you are white, you're fine. In fact, my favorite thing to do is to look at police reports, and they always describe the race of a person of color. Black man, Latino woman, blah, blah, blah. But oftentimes, you know, a man 6 feet tall. Well, doesn't he have a race or identity? And to Katie's point, if I see you in the street, I will describe you wearing a green, and I'd also point out that you're a white woman, you know, with brown hair. I would say that, right? But oftentimes people won't say those things. And I'll tell this really quick story and I'll stop. When I was in graduate school, I was looking for an assistantship, and I was trying to find a woman at a career fair. And I talked to 4 people about this woman. Her name was Stephanie. Like, oh, Stephanie, wearing a green dress, she's got high heels on, she's got these beautiful earrings. The 4th person, and she's black, I found her in 2 minutes. And I'm like, I wish you had kind of led with that, but people were so hesitant to use the racial identifier. But I always, when I'm trying to describe somebody, I would describe them by height, by racial categorization, gender, if I can understand that, and ability status. If somebody is in a wheelchair, I'll say this person uses a wheelchair. That's actually a helpful way to find people. And I think we all talk about ways that we are erased, and I think one thing about whiteness is that it is the normalization and just what I have as white, if I was a white person, is just the way things are supposed to be. And you're the one who's deviant, versus the fact we all have phenotype. We all have skin tone. We all have culture, versus saying some of us do and some of us don't. And before I heard the person's like, well, I wish I had a culture. You have a culture. You need to do some work to find out what it is, but you do have one.
identifying that whiteness is also cultural is a wonderful way to contextualize it and reframe it and make room for other bodies and other races as well. So I also like the idea, Rich, of, when you're reframing even products that perpetuate whiteness, so skin lightening creams, hair straightening creams, and so on, and just while you're walking with your children at HEB, pointing out the hair straightening creams and saying, this is to try to make people look whiter or more European, and that's a wonderful way to reframe those products and very generative as well. So before I move into Q&A, I just wanted to end with a quote just to keep us thinking about what the goal of creating races were in the first place. So the French theorist Colette Guillemot, she says that it is not race which created racism. It was actually racism which created race. So racism is our desire to manipulate and distribute power. That is what was pre-existing, and we simply created race as a way to manage and distribute that power to diminish certain bodies and uphold others. And if race and racism are both manufactured both manufactured topics and concepts which attempt to manage power, they're tools with which we manage power, then we also have tools with which to unmanage that power and unlearn those systems that we've put into place. And we do that by talking about race with our children. So I invite you all to thank our panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you for speaking with us, sharing with us, but also being vulnerable with us, because this is difficult to talk about. All right? So wonderful audience members, we're ready for your questions. Yes, I'm going to go back and forth. So
I have a question. So my family is all very white, grew up in all white. And
Right
so
on.
my kids
White on!
So my kids see how we celebrate everything, and I don't want them to say, they start to say that, oh, that's not normal food, or how we celebrate birthdays or Christmas is the normal way. And so how, other than books and things, how can I show them other ways to do it and not have it turn into cultural tourism? Like
A culture vulture, yeah.
Yeah. So can you talk about how to introduce them to those things but not be a voyeur?
Yeah, this is a really good point. And I think one thing we've talked about is this idea of being a constant learner and being humble. And so I think you have to give yourself the ability to try things and realize, okay, that was the wrong way to do that, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of times, for instance, if you have a diverse group of friends, you may go to a celebration and they may sing happy birthday in Spanish, or, a lot of black people sing happy birthday, the Stevie Wonder version, a little different. There you go. And I think people have to understand that, first of all, whiteness is often parodied as being like corny and like the mainstream kind of thing. And I think it's fine to have, but a lot of things that are considered to be quote unquote mainstream and white culture, we do it as well. Like, you can go to parties where Latinx folks are having a party that looks just like, everything else. So I think this understanding that, reading books, I think to Katie's point, is a good way of saying, hey, we read this book and there's this custom in the book. We should try that. Oftentimes our kids would come home and say, we want to do Kwanzaa. Not just my kids, but white kids. Can we do Kwanzaa? And you read the book about Kwanzaa, you learn what the candles mean, and there's nothing about Kwanzaa that's exclusively for black people. It's more of a community uplifting event. And so there's things you can do like that. And then certainly I think this idea of leveraging the resources in our community, getting to know folks who worship differently, who are in the educational space, perhaps that they're doing things that you can come and observe or be a part of. And a lot of times, going to a drum circle, going to a powwow, like you go to these things and like people are like, come and join us. Don't just watch us, come and get involved. And that's often a neat way to do it.
Yeah, I'll add to that. So I recently got invited to my first bar mitzvah. Yeah. That was fun. That was different. I'm not Jewish. I'm Christian. So for me, it's like being able to come into this and like learn of Jewish customs, knowing that Christianity derives from that, was like very helpful. And it was very different. And there were like elements of it in which I was wrestling with discomfort because I didn't understand what was going on. And I didn't understand what they were saying. And that was humbling. but it was good. And my daughter was with me. That was challenging.